Most people think kings became kings because their father was king. You inherit the throne, right? That's how monarchy works. Not in Sparta. In ancient Sparta, being born a prince meant absolutely nothing. Your father could be the most powerful king in Greek history, and you could still be rejected as unworthy to rule. Because Spartans didn't just inherit their kings, they inspected them, they tested them, and if you failed those tests, you would never wear the crown, no matter whose son you were. This is the story of how Spartans actually chose their kings. And I'm warning you right now, the selection process was brutal. It started at birth, and it involved decisions that would horrify any modern person. Let's talk about what it really took to become a Spartan king. The unique Spartan system. First, you need to understand something that made Sparta completely different from every other ancient kingdom. Sparta didn't have one king, they had two. At any given time, Sparta was ruled by two kings from two different royal families, the Ageids and the Eurypontids. These families claimed descent from Heracles himself, the legendary hero Hercules, and both families had equal claim to power. Why two kings? According to Spartan tradition, when the legendary founders Aristodemus' twin sons were born, nobody could decide which twin should rule. So they made both of them kings. And for nearly 900 years, Sparta maintained this dual monarchy system. But here's where it gets interesting. These two kings weren't partners. They were competitors. They checked each other's power. If one king proposed a military campaign, the other could oppose it. If one tried to become too powerful, the other would push back. It was a built-in system of rivalry that prevented any single person from gaining absolute control. And both kings knew that their sons wouldn't automatically inherit their throne. They would have to prove themselves worthy. The first test, birth inspection. The selection process for Spartan kings began at the moment of birth. And I mean the exact moment. When a boy was born into one of the two royal families, he wasn't immediately declared heir. Instead, within hours of his birth, he was brought before the Gerousia, the Council of Elders, for inspection. Here's what they were looking for. Physical perfection. The elders examined the infant for any signs of weakness or deformity. Was he strong? Were his limbs properly formed? Did he show signs of health and vigor? Because in Sparta, a king needed to be physically perfect. He would lead armies in battle. He would need to endure the same hardships as his warriors. A weak or deformed king was unacceptable. If the baby passed this initial inspection, he was allowed to live and continue in the royal line. If he failed, well, we don't have definitive historical records of what happened to rejected royal infants, but Spartan law allowed for the exposure of weak children. The stakes were that high, even for princes. But passing the birth inspection was just the beginning. The agoge. No exceptions for princes. At age 7, every Spartan boy, including princes, entered the agoge, the brutal state training system that turned children into warriors. Now, you might think that royal children got special treatment. Maybe they had tutors in the palace while common children suffered in the barracks. Maybe they got extra food or softer beds. Absolutely not. Spartan princes went through the exact same training as every other boy. They slept in the same cold barracks. They received the same inadequate food rations. They endured the same beatings. They participated in the same brutal competitions. Actually, it was arguably worse for royal children because everyone was watching them. If a common boy showed weakness, maybe the instructors would overlook it. But a prince, a future king, he had to be better than everyone else, not equal to them. The expectations were higher. The scrutiny was more intense. The agoge lasted until age 20. That's 13 years of constant physical training, military drill, survival exercises, and controlled violence. 13 years of proving you were worthy to be called a Spartan warrior, let alone a Spartan king. Many boys didn't survive the agoge. Some died from exposure, malnutrition, or training accidents. Others survived but were permanently injured. And some simply couldn't handle it mentally and were deemed unfit for military service. Any prince who failed the agoge lost his claim to the throne. It didn't matter if he was the eldest son of the current king. If he couldn't complete the training that every Spartan warrior completed, he was not fit to rule Sparta. The crypteia, earning respect. But completing the agoge wasn't enough. After age 20, every Spartan man, including princes, had to be accepted into a crypteia, a military dining mess. Here's how this worked. Spartan warriors ate together in these communal groups of about 15 men. To join a crypteia, you needed to be voted in by the existing members. It was unanimous. If even one man rejected you, you couldn't join. And if you couldn't join a crypteia, you lost your citizenship. You became a lesser, a man without full rights in Spartan society. Imagine being a prince, the son of the king, and being rejected by a group of common warriors because they didn't think you were good enough to eat with them. It happened. Historical records mention royal family members who were rejected by various crypteia groups and had to try multiple times before being accepted. This was crucial because a Spartan king needed to have the respect of the warriors he would command. If they wouldn't even eat with you, how could you lead them into battle? The 5 ephors, the true power. Now here's something that shocks most people when they learn about Spartan government. The kings weren't even the most powerful people in Sparta. The real power lay with the 5 ephors, 5 elected officials who served 1-year terms and had the authority to overrule the kings, prosecute them, fine them, and even exile them. Every month, the kings and ephors exchanged oaths. The kings swore to rule according to Spartan law. The ephors swore to uphold the kingship, but only as long as the kings kept their oath. If a king stepped out of line, the ephors could put him on trial. They could strip him of command. They could even execute him for crimes against the state. So when we talk about choosing a Spartan king, we're not just talking about selecting who sits on the throne. We're talking about a continuous process of evaluation that lasted the king's entire reign. The ephors were constantly watching, judging, ready to remove any king who proved unworthy. Primogeniture, but with exceptions. In theory, the eldest son of a king inherited the throne when his father died. That's standard primogeniture, the same system used in most monarchies. But Sparta added crucial exceptions. First, the son had to have been born after his father became king. If a man had 3 sons, then became king, and then had a 4th son, the 4th son, not the eldest, would be heir to the throne. This was because a son born to a reigning king was considered born in the purple, born to royalty, while his older brothers were technically born to a commoner. Second, if the eldest eligible son was deemed unfit, physically weak, mentally unstable, or lacking military ability, he could be passed over in favor of a younger brother. The Gerousia and the ephors had to approve the succession, and they could reject an heir they considered unworthy. Third, if there were no legitimate sons, the crown could pass to a brother, uncle, or even a more distant relative, as long as he was from the correct royal bloodline and could prove his worth. This system created intense competition between brothers and royal families. They weren't just siblings, they were rivals for the throne, and only one of them would wear the crown. Military command, the ultimate test. But all of this surviving birth inspection, completing the agoge, joining a crypteia, gaining the respect of warriors, all of this was just qualification. The real test of whether a prince was worthy to be king came on the battlefield. Spartan kings led from the front. This wasn't symbolic. When Sparta went to war, one of the 2 kings personally commanded the army in the field. He marched with the soldiers. He slept in the same camps. And he fought in the front ranks of the phalanx. Think about what this means. A Spartan king couldn't sit safely in a palace while his warriors fought and died. He had to prove, over and over, that he deserved to give them orders by standing next to them in combat. Historical records show numerous Spartan kings who died in battle. King Leonidas at Thermopylae is the most famous, but he wasn't the only one. Spartan kings fell in combat regularly because they took the same risks as their men. And before a prince could become king, he needed to prove himself in war. He needed battle experience. He needed to show tactical skill, personal courage, and the ability to inspire warriors to follow him into danger. A prince who had never fought, never led men in combat, never proven himself under fire, that prince would never be accepted as king, even if he was the legitimate heir. The physical standard. Here's something that would be controversial today. Spartan kings had to maintain peak physical condition throughout their entire reign. Remember, Sparta had the agoge to ensure that all warriors were physically elite. But kings had an additional burden. They had to remain physically dominant even as they aged. A king who became fat, weak, or unable to fight in the phalanx would lose the respect of his warriors. And without that respect, the ephors would find a reason to remove him from power. Historical accounts describe Spartan kings exercising daily, even in their 50s and 60s. They had to. Their legitimacy as rulers depended on their physical prowess just as much as their bloodline. There's a famous story about King Agesilaus II, who ruled Sparta from 398 to 360 BC. He was born with a club foot, a physical deformity that, under normal circumstances, should have disqualified him from kingship. But Agesilaus was passed over initially in favor of his nephew. It was only when that nephew died and no other suitable heir existed that Agesilaus was given a chance. And you know what he did? He became one of Sparta's greatest military commanders, leading successful campaigns into his 70s. He proved that even with a physical handicap, he could still fight, still lead, still win battles. He overcompensated for his weakness by being more aggressive, more tactical, more successful than any of his physically perfect rivals. But the fact that his deformity was even questioned shows how seriously Spartans took the physical requirements for kingship. The crypteia, the secret test. Now we get into the darker aspects of Spartan king selection, aspects that most historians don't like to discuss. The crypteia was a secret rite of passage for elite young Spartans, including those in line for the throne. Here's how it worked. Selected young men, usually around age 20, were sent out into the countryside with nothing but a knife and orders to survive by their wits. They had to steal food, avoid detection, and most importantly, hunt and kill helots, the enslaved population that worked Spartan lands. This served two purposes. First, it kept the helot population terrorized and less likely to rebel. Second, it tested whether a young warrior could kill without hesitation, survive alone, and make life or death decisions without guidance. For a prince, completing the crypteia was essential. It proved you could be ruthless when necessary. It proved you could survive in the harshest conditions. And it proved you valued Spartan security over personal morality. A prince who refused to participate in the crypteia or who showed weakness during it would be viewed as soft, unfit to make the hard decisions that a king must make. Modern people find this horrifying, and they should. It was horrifying. But it was also how Sparta maintained its society, and any man who wanted to rule that society had to prove he could uphold its darkest traditions. Speaking with authority. Here's something many people don't know. Spartan kings had to be effective public speakers. Sparta had a citizen assembly where important decisions were debated. The kings needed to persuade the assembly to support their proposals. They needed to give rousing speeches before battles. They needed to conduct diplomacy with foreign powers. This was particularly challenging because Spartan culture valued brief, direct speech, what we now call laconic communication, named after Laconia, the region around Sparta. Spartans hated long-winded speeches and excessive words. A prince had to learn the art of saying exactly what needed to be said in as few words as possible, but with maximum impact. This was its own kind of test, intellectual rather than physical. But just as important, there are records of princes who were brilliant warriors but terrible speakers, and their claims to the throne were weakened because they couldn't inspire confidence with their words. Marrying well, securing the bloodline. Here's another crucial but often overlooked aspect of becoming a Spartan king. You had to marry the right woman. Spartan women had more freedom and power than women in other Greek city-states. They controlled property, participated in athletics, and had significant influence in choosing their husbands. A prince needed to marry a woman from a powerful Spartan family, someone who would strengthen political alliances and produce strong heirs. But she also had to be willing to marry him, which meant he needed to prove his worth to her and her family. Spartan women were famous for their blunt assessment of men. They would openly mock warriors who showed cowardice. They expected their husbands to be physically strong, mentally tough, and successful in battle. A prince who couldn't attract a suitable wife was seen as weak, and his claim to the throne would be questioned. Because if he couldn't manage his own household, how could he manage an entire state? The rival brother problem. Throughout Spartan history, succession disputes between brothers were common and often violent. Since younger brothers born after their father became king could inherit over older brothers born before, and since the system allowed for passing over unworthy heirs, Brothers in royal families were constantly competing and sometimes conspiring against each other. There are historical records of brothers accusing each other of cowardice in battle, trying to get each other rejected from Syssitia groups, and even plotting assassinations. The ephors sometimes had to arbitrate these disputes, but their decisions weren't always fair. Political factors, which brother had more supporters, which brother the ephors personally preferred, could influence who ended up wearing the crown. This meant that to become king, you didn't just need to be worthy, you also needed to be more worthy than your brothers. And sometimes, you needed to be ruthless enough to eliminate them as threats. Case study: Leonidas. Let's talk about the most famous Spartan king of all, Leonidas, the man who led the 300 at Thermopylae. Leonidas wasn't supposed to be king. He had two older brothers, Dorias and Cleomenes. According to Spartan law, one of them should have inherited the throne. Cleomenes became king when their father died, and he ruled for about 30 years, but Cleomenes went insane, literally. Historical accounts describe him laughing maniacally, attacking random citizens with his walking stick, and eventually mutilating himself with a knife before dying. The ephors determined that Cleomenes was unfit to rule and began planning succession. The second brother, Dorias, had left Sparta years earlier to found a colony in Sicily, where he died in battle. That left Leonidas third in line, never expected to rule as the only viable heir. But Leonidas had done everything right. He had completed the agoge with distinction. He had fought in multiple campaigns. He had married Gorgo, the daughter of the previous king, strengthening his claim. He had the respect of the warriors and the approval of the ephors. So when his brother's madness made succession necessary, Leonidas was ready. He had prepared his entire life for a throne he never expected to sit on. And when the moment came, he proved worthy of it by leading the most famous last stand in history. Case study: Agesilaus II. We mentioned Agesilaus earlier, the king with the club foot. His story shows both the flexibility and the ruthlessness of the Spartan king selection system. Agesilaus was initially passed over for the throne in favor of his nephew Leonidas. But there were whispers that Leonidas wasn't actually the son of the previous king, that his mother had been having an affair with the Athenian general Alcibiades. The ephors investigated. They questioned whether Leonidas had legitimate royal blood, and ultimately, they decided to pass him over and give the throne to Agesilaus instead. Now, was this decision based purely on concerns about bloodline legitimacy, or was it politically motivated? Agesilaus had powerful supporters, while Leonidas didn't. Historical sources disagree. What we know for certain is that Agesilaus used the questionable succession to prove himself. He launched aggressive military campaigns. He reformed Spartan tactics. He became one of Sparta's most effective kings precisely because he knew his claim was contested and he needed to prove his worth every single day. The decline. What happened when standards slipped? Here's the tragic part of this story. Sparta's system of choosing worthy kings worked beautifully for centuries, but it eventually failed. By the 3rd century BC, Sparta was in decline. The population had decreased dramatically. The number of true Spartiate citizens, full Spartan warriors, had dropped from about 8,000 to fewer than 1,000. And as Sparta weakened, the kings became weaker too. They started buying their positions through bribery. They started avoiding military service. The ephors became corrupt and stopped enforcing the old standards. Kings were chosen not because they had survived the agoge, proven themselves in battle, and earned the respect of warriors. They were chosen because they were rich, because they had political connections, because they were willing to pay bribes. The brutal selection process that had created warriors like Leonidas was abandoned, and Sparta, which had been the most feared military power in Greece for 400 years, collapsed. By 146 BC, Sparta was conquered by Rome and ceased to exist as an independent state. The warrior culture that had produced the 300 at Thermopylae was gone. Lessons from Spartan king selection. So what can we learn from how Spartans chose their kings? Why does this matter 2,500 years later? Lesson 1. Leadership must be earned, not inherited. The Spartan system recognized that being born to power doesn't make you worthy of power. You had to prove yourself through the same trials as everyone else. Imagine if modern leaders had to pass the same tests as the people they governed. Lesson 2. Leaders must maintain standards. Spartan kings couldn't rest on their laurels. They had to stay physically fit, militarily competent, and politically effective throughout their entire reign, or they would be removed. Leadership was a continuous test, not a one-time achievement. Lesson 3. Physical courage matters in leadership. We live in an age where leaders can send others to die while they remain safe. Spartan kings led from the front. They took the same risks they asked their warriors to take. That created a different kind of respect and legitimacy. Lesson 4. Systems require maintenance. Sparta's selection process worked for centuries because the ephors enforced it rigorously. When they stopped enforcing it, when corruption crept in, when standards slipped, the entire system collapsed. Good systems don't run themselves. They require constant vigilance. Lesson 5. Ruthless standards can be effective but unsustainable. Sparta's brutal selection process produced incredible leaders and warriors, but it also made their society rigid, cruel, and ultimately unable to adapt to changing circumstances. There's a cost to extremism, even when that extremism produces short-term success. The legacy. Today, when we talk about leadership, we often focus on charisma, communication skills, education credentials, things that can be learned or faked. Sparta took a different approach. They said, "Can you endure what we endure? Can you fight where we fight? Can you maintain the standards we maintain? If not, you don't deserve to lead us." It was brutal. It was harsh. By modern standards, it was often cruel. But it produced leaders who were genuinely worthy of the title. Men who had proven themselves through years of testing and trial. When King Leonidas stood at Thermopylae with his 300, he wasn't there because he had inherited a throne and demanded that others fight for him. He was there because he had spent his entire life proving he deserved to stand beside them. That's the difference between a Spartan king and the kings of most other nations. Spartan kings led warriors who knew with absolute certainty that their king had earned the right to command them. Conclusion. So, how did Spartans actually choose their kings? They didn't choose them in a single moment. They tested them from birth. They evaluated them at age 7. They trained them brutally for 13 years. They required them to earn the respect of their warriors. They made them prove themselves in battle. They gave them enemies, both foreign and within their own family, and watched how they responded. And even after a man became king, they continued to test him. Every day, every decision, every battle. The ephors watched, the warriors judged. And if he failed to maintain the standards that had made him king, they would remove him without hesitation. It was a system that produced some of history's greatest warrior kings. It was also a system so demanding, so ruthless, so unforgiving, that it ultimately consumed itself. But for about 400 years, it worked. Sparta's dual monarchy, with all its tests and trials and brutal selection processes, created leaders who were worthy of the warriors they commanded. And maybe that's the real lesson. True leadership isn't given. It's earned. Not once, but continuously. Not through birth or connections or wealth, but through the same trials and hardships as the people you lead. Spartan kings didn't sit on thrones and issue orders from safety. They stood in the front rank of the phalanx, shields locked with their warriors, spears ready, knowing that if they fell, they would fall as warriors, not as rulers watching from a distance. That's what it meant to be a Spartan king. That's what it took to earn the right to lead the most feared warriors in the ancient world. And that's a standard of leadership we still talk about 2,500 years later.